Okay, it is my pleasure to introduce Mónica Guzmán. Mónica is the director of Braver Angels, which you all have hopefully heard about. It's a nonpartisan nonprofit that aims to bridge the kind of growing divide, particularly in the US. She's also author of the book, I Never Thought of It That Way, Having Fearlessly Curious Conversations in a Dangerously Divided World. Um, and she was a 2016 Neiman. Um, and I'm really excited to have her here kind of post midterms, pre 2024, to speak with you all, particularly about how, as you're covering politics day in, day out, you can think about, I mean, we've all kind of been in dismay at kind of the political polarization. So how you can think about that in your coverage and what to do about it. So please join me in welcoming Mónica.
Hey everyone. I didn't realize actually that this would be in person for all of you and virtual for me. That's kind of delightful. So hi, it's really an honor to get to connect with you all today. Um, I thought I'd start just by telling you a little bit about the path that I walked into this work. And I'm hoping that through questions from you, we can have a really good discussion about how curiosity across the political divide can lend ideas and insights to the practice of journalism today. So, one path to my work in bridge building, which is this booming space right now, has been through journalism. I didn't realize it until sort of embarrassingly recently, but journalism is this practice of having lots of conversations that are about understanding without judgment. When we go and we interview sources, when we write feature stories, most of the stories written to tell the stories of our communities across the country, and many of them in politics, are about trying to, with some fealty, represent why people do what they do, how they came to whatever conclusions they have come, because something about them is relevant to their community, and something about telling their story responsibly is going to make our community stronger. In a polarized time, conversations of understanding without judgment are increasingly rare. And that's something that I noticed really hit a fever pitch around the 2016 presidential election. So with journalism, the core idea that I think is so key that journalism can give is it helps us understand each other. It helps us understand each other even when it seems impossible. And that's something that I've taken to heart. So when I started to see, in the last several years, that those pathways to understanding seemed so frayed, it felt like there was this foundational brokenness underneath everything. I started to pay more attention to polarization, to political polarization in particular. Now, here's the other really key thread that led to my work, is my family. So I'm a Mexican immigrant, and I'm the daughter of Mexican immigrants. And they voted twice very enthusiastically for Donald Trump. I voted for Hillary Clinton and then President Biden. And I remember I live here in Seattle, a deeply blue Democratic place. After the 2016 presidential election, I would go to get-togethers and other networking events or dinners with friends, whatever. And most of my network is liberal like me, by far, by far, by far. And I would start to hear the anxiety and the fear and the tension that was so pronounced in the heels of that election. And inevitably, that tension and that fear would creep toward statements about people who had voted for Trump. And as it crept toward that, given that I was very, very close and deeply loved my parents who had voted for Trump, and that I had actually somehow miraculously managed to have conversations with them where I could say that I understood why they made that choice, and they understood why I didn't and why I made a different choice. I would find myself saying, like taking a little sip of a drink and just saying, well, my parents are Mexican immigrants who voted for Trump. And back then, it was kind of amazing. A lot of times, it would just stop conversation. Just people would turn to me, look uncomfortable, and I started to realize that I was doing this repeatedly, and it was a kind of test. And part of what I was testing was, would anyone ask me why? You know, would they change the subject? Would they walk away? Or would they ask me why? And when they did ask me why, it was exciting because I could tell them. You know, my parents and I have had the kind of conversations, and they've said, yeah, you know, when people ask, like, feel free to talk about my mom's positions on abortion. Feel free to talk about how for my dad, who was a very loyal fan of the TV show House, about the diagnostic doctor who breaks all the rules and pisses everyone off, but is out to save lives, that's how he sees the kind of strength that Trump has. Like, feel free to tell them that. So as I'm working on depolarization and I'm studying more of this world, part of the thing that's in the back of my head, I go, well, obviously it's impossible right now for people who are leaning blue and leaning red to work together and kind of lead. I mean, that's what we're seeing in our politics, is what we're seeing all around. And then I discovered an organization that I now work for called Braver Angels. So we're the largest nonpartisan grassroots nonprofit dedicated to political depolarization. There's about 90 chapters all across the country. And by definition, they must have half red and half blue leadership. And when I witnessed a Braver Angels debate, which is this huge virtual event, happens every month, takes on the most divisive topics, they had somehow figured out a structure that allowed people to collectively search for truth. It wasn't a debate where one side or the other won on the debate on vaccine mandates. It was more, we're here to be able to listen to the other side so that we can understand it. Not so that we can agree with it, but so that we can understand it. And after that, I was like, well, I'm volunteering for this organization until I can find a way to work there. And that's where I am now. So the book, I never thought of it that way, is sort of the culmination of a lot of these paths, these sort of three paths, and some of the stories that I've witnessed, and some of the insights and principles that I think can be really, really powerful for cutting across polarization in this particular time. And the starting problem for me begins with this, that we are so divided, we're blinded. There's a lot of research, it's chilling, you've probably seen a bunch of it, that shows that when people are asked to look at the other side and guess at the views on the other side, we're constantly exaggerating, and that this happens on both sides. For polarization, there's different kinds of polarization. There's ideological polarization, which is the actual division based on actual disagreement. But there's also something called affective polarization. And affective polarization is the division and polarization that we have in our society based on how we feel about the other side. And some of you have probably seen the data on that increasingly elections are about being against them more than they are being for us. Some studies on that have been pretty chilling too, including one that showed that both sides assume the other side despises them twice as much as they actually do. So what we've got is sort of a communications landscape where people's view of each other is extremely warped. I think of three dynamics that have gotten together in this perfect storm, this mess, that have helped lead us to this place. I call it the SOS: sorting, othering, and siloing. Sorting is the very natural human tendency to want to be around people who are like us. You know, we all are familiar with this. It's how we make friends. Especially in times of stress and distrust and fear and a lot of turbulence like we've been experiencing in our society for a while. The last thing you want is a relationship that's going to challenge you and grate on you and add a lot of friction. So we see that blue zip codes are getting bluer. We see that red zip codes are getting redder. When Ezra Klein published his book, Why Are We Polarized? Back then, it was a little unsure if there was really evidence that we were sorting ourselves geographically. Now it's pretty clear that there is. Then there's othering. Othering is the very natural human tendency to put distance between us and those we deem too different. And research going back to the 50s, 60s on this stuff shows pretty definitively that the difference doesn't even have to be meaningful for us to even subtly discriminate against each other over it. When the differences are meaningful, when you start to think the other side is evil and out to destroy democracy or whatever, then wow, the othering can be pretty intense. And you start to address a label or a group rather than a person. You stop being able to see the person or the individual in the story. And then there is siloing. And siloing is something that we journalists are very familiar with. It's largely, thanks to these folks. And it's about the stories we hear as a result of sorting and othering, and the stories we don't hear. It's not that we're not exposed, that a lot of people in a polarized society are not exposed to other perspectives, but when we are exposed to other perspectives, it is more often through layers and layers of framings and judgments put on by people who would agree with us. So add it up, that has led us to this place where we find ourselves in, where we're so divided, we're blinded. Now, the thing that I have found is extraordinarily powerful and underappreciated for how we can get through this also happens to be one of the core values of journalism, which is curiosity. So people think of curiosity sometimes as being sort of intellectually selfish. I'm curious because I want to learn and I want to enrich myself. But what I've observed is that curiosity is a form of care, and that curiosity can be an extraordinary gift, and that curiosity is a way of showing people that they matter. We talk about listening and the importance of listening, and I delve into this a good bit in the book. Listening, paying attention, being present. But if listening is about showing people they matter, then the way you show people they matter is by aiming your curiosity at them. The other day, actually, I was meeting up with a friend, and we had like a thing we needed to work on, right? And something kind of cool had just happened to me, but I was like, we don't have time. She doesn't care about this right now. We need to get to work. And so we're sitting there talking, and she's like, how was your day? And I tell her, and I kind of like begin saying, oh, something cool kind of happened to me, but let's work. And she goes, oh, what happened? And I tell her, and then, oh, wait, how did that feel? And I tell her more, and she actually really wants to know. And I remembered that simple principle about how great it can feel to be heard, how great it can feel to be seen and understood, and for someone else to actually take an interest in you. So that, I think, is also curiosity. Curiosity can be a very selfless and very connecting type of cognitive ability. Now, another great thing about curiosity is how easy it is to turn on. So the neurological research on it, which there's not enough, but it shows that curiosity is activated whenever there is a gap between what we know and what we want to know. And it can be super simple and silly, like sitting at a bar with friends and being like, what was that movie with that guy? What was that movie with that guy? Until somebody pulls out their phone and looks it up. It's like an itch you can't scratch. You gotta find out. But it can be a lot more severe. It can be, when will the vaccines come out? When will my kid be able to be vaccinated? Or when are they going to lift these mask mandates from my school district? I'm tired of this. And so you go and you check the news over and over and over again because curiosity is leading you there. So those two are examples of what's called deprivation-based curiosity. That's the curiosity that's an itch you can't scratch, where as soon as you get an answer, any answer, whew, that stress is gone and you can move on. Another form of curiosity that's, I think, a lot more powerful is interest-based curiosity. It's a more adventurous curiosity. So anytime, if you have found yourself learning something new, I was once, this is weird, but I was once in Hawaii, and we ended up having lunch at this restaurant that Fleetwood Mac's drummer started. And I cannot tell you how this happened, but I ended up staying up until 3 a.m. devouring the Fleetwood Mac Wikipedia page and learning about the sex, drugs, and rock and roll and the relationships of this band that I've always loved but never looked up. That's interest-based curiosity, where one question leads to another, to another, to another. And before you know it, you're just learning so much. It can be so overpowering. So to to make a long story short, I suppose, one really interesting and in-depth strategy to help understand, to understand other people is to convert deprivation-based curiosity about ideas into interest-based curiosity about people. Now, this is a concept that I think journalists understand better than most. If you've ever been in an interview where you walked in just needing an answer to this one thing, I just need a quote, I'm pretty sure I know what I'm going to get here, and I just need to understand like the reason that this person did X. But you end up discovering that this person is more than they seem, and you become interested in the person. One reason this is so important to do in a hyperpolarized world, or to bring out in a hyperpolarized world, is that we do a lot of our discussion, as you know, about politics and everything else on the internet. We do a lot of discussion on platforms that boil down the full power of conversation to some words and some emojis. It's like bringing a tiny little toolbox into a big job. It doesn't make sense. The internet is a non-place that makes us into non-people. And so one of the goals of journalists in this day and age can be to make sure that we are people again, to make sure that the stories we tell are stories of people, that we are not addressing a label, but that we are getting underneath to the story. So there are some ways that we can do that, and I think about 5 in particular, 5 conditions of conversation whenever we are trying to bridge a divide or understand something confounding about someone else. We have to make sure that there is enough time, that there is enough attention. The people in conversation are actually paying attention to each other. They don't have 10 tabs open, or they're not like waiting for the bus and like barely paying attention to this thread. There's parity, which I mean in the technological platform sense, parity. If someone posts on Facebook and someone else comments on Facebook, the one with the power is the person who's posting. They can hide or block or delete your comment. You're not going to get a candid exchange. Then there's containment, which I think is extremely important in a deeper way to the journalistic mission, and I hope we get to why a little bit later on. But containment is the degree to which conversations are contained to the people actually participating in them. A lot of our discussions happen in places where we're discussing in front of an unknown audience of potentially mass size. And so what people end up doing is they end up performing perspectives instead of exploring perspectives. So what we'll do is have proxy battles. What we'll do is we'll borrow talking points that we've heard, that others have taken shelter under, and we'll call them our own, and we'll deploy them, right, into these arguments online. And what are we really learning? And then finally, embodiment. So you're seeing me, at least with my gestures. I gesture a lot. You're hearing my voice and my tone. There's other places where most of the human toolbox of communication is just not at the ready. So converting deprivation-based curiosity about ideas into interest-based curiosity about people can really get us somewhere. It can get us to more honesty and more truth in a place where, as you know, I mean, the research is also showing that people are so scared to share their honest opinions about politics to each other, let alone to you, to journalists. I mean, it's tough, it's tricky. And you all, I was looking at some of your bios, a lot of you cover the Senate, you cover Congress. The way that politics works right now and that politicians are doing their work is contributing to quite a sense of hopelessness and despair among people. Because they're thinking, if this is how our leaders behave, it's all getting so mucked up. A lot of them are not the fierce partisans that tend to dominate our conversation, that tend to lead our discourse. And so they don't know when they'll ever be relevant, when their perspectives will be relevant enough to break that. So my work rests pretty solidly on the premise that we don't have to wait for politicians to figure this out. And we don't have to wait even for us journalists or media institutions to figure this out, that every conversation can be one level more curious, that it's worth it to approach even the people we are afraid of, because it is so clear that there is so much that we are missing about each other and our perspectives. So I'll tell one story, and then I'm happy to take guidance, but I can also open it up because there's so many directions to go. But the other day I was speaking to a journalist, and we were talking about what brought us into journalism. And he illustrated one of, I think, the most powerful principles of how journalism can be really curious in a divided time. And it was from something that happened when he was a very, very young journalist in a small town paper. His editor told him, hey, there's this old man who is refusing to sell his house so that we can build this new highway that everybody wants built. I want you to go to his house and figure out why he doesn't want to leave. So he goes to his house, he brings his little flippy notebook, and he asks the man, so why don't you want to leave? And the man is not very, like, his reasons aren't really forthcoming. It kind of doesn't make a lot of sense. But the reporter is in the man's house, and he's looking around, and the house looks like something out of something that was frozen in a time capsule in like 1985 or something. And he ends up learning by talking to the man and learning more about him that that was the year his wife died. Wow, okay. He ends up learning that he was a postman, like a post office delivery person for his whole career, and that he loves this community. He knows everyone that he delivers mail to. Okay. But it was the story that the man told about World War II, when he was coming over. He was on a big, big boat coming over the Panama Canal, and it was the middle of the night. And all of his, colleagues in arms were asleep in those like stacked up bunks that they have in the bowels of those ships. And, he put on some clothes and he came out and he watched the boat cross the Panama Canal in the darkness. And he told the reporter that he felt he had to do that because once he got home, he knew he was never leaving. He was so homesick, from that war the whole time. And he just knew, once I'm home, I'm never going to leave. That's going to be where I stay. And the reporter realized that's the reason. That's the reason. It was the stories. It was the house and how it reflected him. It was those things that told the reporter the answer. It was getting curious about the person that told the reporter the answer. And as soon as he sort of realized that and sort of confirmed it with the man, he couldn't wait to tell that story to the community so that they could understand. And the principle that this illustrates is this. A lot of times when we want to get curious, and many journalists, why not? The question we want to ask is why? Why do you do what you do? But at a time of polarization and deep division and distrust and suspicion, asking why can make people feel like you want them to justify themselves. Like they have to prove that they matter before you're willing to believe that they matter. So asking how gets them to talk about the one thing that they're absolutely an expert on, that there's not like a fake news thing, right? It's their own story. You ask them to take you on a tour instead of putting them on a trial. And they get to step back and look into their own story instead of the talking points, instead of the narratives that we're also beholden to. These are the sorts of questions that help us unlock from these fixed narratives in our silos and connect with something that's a little truer, hopefully, underneath, that can help us see people again. And I think that's going to be such a big key part of unlocking this polarization puzzle for a lot of us. So I'm going to stop there, not because there isn't more to say, but because we really can go in so many directions, and I'm really curious where you all want to take it.
Thank you so much. Does anyone have any questions off the bat? Certainly you've probably heard people talk about, how do I present this in a way that's not kind of amplifying positions that maybe don't warrant the kind of same consideration as others that are more fact-based. So, whether you're talking about climate change or vaccinations or whatever. So how do you make kind of, multiple sides feel heard, and when you're dealing with that kind of information as a journalist?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that, because this is a tricky formula for journalists. It's already tricky enough for regular people, right? Like I have people coming up to me all the time saying, what do I do if the person I'm trying to build a bridge with just said something that's completely bogus, and maybe not even just bogus, but harmful? It's just completely wrong. Everything I know tells me that this is wrong. And this is where I So I'll begin here. There's a framework by my friend Buster Benson. He wrote a book called Why Are We Yelling? And he talks about the 3 types of conversation across disagreement. There's the conversation about what is true, the conversation about what is meaningful, and the conversation about what is useful. So really any disagreement is fitting into, one or more of those buckets. In journalism, it sort of feels like the only conversation we're interested in is the conversation about what is true, or at least that conversation should take priority. we need to tell the truth. That's the mandate. Here's the issue. The issue right now is that there's so little trust. And I've asked myself sometimes, journalism to me seems clearly to be sort of a truth-building institution in our society. Journalism is out there looking under the rocks and making sure that we know what's really going on. And it's super important. So that's our truth-building institution. Cool. So when I go, what's our trust-building institution? And I look around and I cannot find it. I think that our trust-building institution is and has always been the organic, natural relationships that citizens and residents have across difference. Those relationships have been fraying and breaking, one burned bridge at a time, one uninvited relative to Thanksgiving at a time. That may all seem really small and insignificant. It's not. I think it's everything. So here's where it comes back to that framework about the conversations across disagreement. The only conversation that builds trust is the conversation about what is meaningful. So this is what that means. Asking people about what concerns them and asking what's behind those concerns for them. These are the sorts of questions. Asking how they came to believe what they believe, asking for their stories. These are the sorts of questions that ask people to give you their meaning. So I've spoken with, and many of you probably have too, I've spoken with people who believe things like the 2020 election was a total fraud. So, you kind of think, well, a lot of regular folks, and I don't know about journalists and, in every case, but a lot of folks sort of think, well, once somebody says something like that, I have a very limited number of options. I can try to correct them because I'm mandated to. I don't know what else to do morally. I can try to correct them and make sure they acknowledge it. Or if not, then I'm going to hit abort. We're done here. I don't know how any of this can go on in a good direction. Now, this is where we have to bring back the condition of containment. So containment is the degree to which conversations are contained to the people actually participating in them. Very often, journalists are having uncontained conversations. You're having public conversations, right? If you're doing a live interview between people and somebody says something is BS, of course you're obligated to correct them. Yes, you have to correct that record, to the best of your understanding. And you have to do it in that live way. But here's the thing. When you're having a contained conversation, it's just you and that source. It's just you and that voter. Then you have an opportunity. You have an opportunity to sidestep the conversation about what is true and have the conversation about what is meaningful. So tell me what led you to this conclusion you've drawn about that election, and you can hear about maybe what media they read, or maybe they had some experience at the polls that year and saw something they didn't like. Maybe some folks that they trust just, are giving them compelling argument, whatever it is. You get curious about the person. So why is this person in particular concerned about these things? And you bring out that meaning. And so you're building trust in that conversation. So I think that when you write the story, you can do the same thing. You can say, I have spoken to this person. I know where these concerns come from. And I believe that it's powerful to share with their community that story, rather than ignore or completely dismiss. This is part of our collective story, whatever it might be. And there's always ethical ways to do it. I was the vice chair of SPJ's ethics committee for several years back in the day, and minimize harm is a very important principle in journalism, as it ought to be for our whole society. But I do believe that the collective search for truth cannot happen without trust. And so if all we want to have is the conversation about what is true, and if it's all we know how to have with people, then we're not going to help them build trust, and we're not going to build trust with them. And everything's just going to get more splintered and more fractured than it already is. We have to sort of ask ourselves, like, what good is it if there's a lot of truth telling, but it's not reaching everyone? And a lot of people are just closed off to it because they are so beyond feeling heard. They distrust media to an alarming degree. So I think these are the things that we're going to need to watch out for. How can journalists have the conversation that is meaningful so that they can facilitate ordinary people's ability to have those conversations with each other too?
Thank you. So I know we have a lot of curious journalists here, and let's say that they all approach interviews with the kind of curiosity that they're talking about. That you're talking about. Do you have recommendations for how they then write the story to help the audience also kind of approach with a bit more of an open mind? I'm sure everyone in here has gotten some really nasty hate mail from probably both sides. And I'm sure there's also lots of people out there that we don't hear from that appreciate what we do. But when you're hearing that kind of stuff day in, day out, it can be wearing. So how can we do the actual writing and reporting and broadcasting in a way that kind of reaches people who are kind of in those extremes?
Yeah. Well, one thing is to acknowledge journalists occupy such a kind of terrible place here because we are kind of the targets, right? We're the ones saying the things, whether you like it or not. And at a hyperpolarized time, for some people, saying that thing is so bad and so harmful and so rejects my way of life or what have you, that they're going to send all kinds of slings and arrows your way. That certainly happened to me. It sucks. It's remarkable. It's remarkable the sort of things that we have to slosh through. So there's that. One thing that comes up as a really big area that there's more and more research being done into it. I highly recommend. There's something called the Trusting News Project by Joy Mayer. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's fantastic. But she's kicking off some research on this that I'm really excited about. Anyway, language. There's so many ways that subtly, when we write our stories, we may be sending signals to people that these stories do not concern them or are not about them or already rule them out. And I think a lot of those signals happen just through the names and frames that we give to the issues on the table. It's extraordinarily challenging. There's no easy way through. With Roe v. Wade and abortion, what do you call the being inside the womb? Do you call it an unborn child? Do you call it a fetus? Because one side will think that calling it an unborn child negates their view, and the other side will think that calling it a fetus negates their view. What do you call the thing, the thing that's inside the person's womb? At Braver Angels, I've run into so many of these things. And I'll share one that is still working its way through my mind that's potentially very consequential, but oof. I was talking with Braver Angels leaders who are more red and conservative, and they're really interested in helping those of us on the Braver Angels media team, understand a little better how conservatives view the media. And he said something that absolutely shocked me, and it was about the word democracy. And he said that, our government is not a democracy, Monica. Like, it really can turn off reds to call it a democracy. And I was like, hold the phone. What the hell are you saying? That sounds terrible. And he said, we're a democratic republic. I was like, okay, say more, right? And he made the point that a more accurate description of our government is that it is a democratic republic. Democracy focuses on majority rule and voting and people and all things that are very important. Republic focuses on the representative parts of our government. And so what he said was really chilling to me, because he was basically saying that so much of the reporting that is wonderful out there about threats to democracy is painted blue. And I was like, damn it. What? Like, is that true? And I've asked a lot of other conservatives, and they sort of sheepishly go like, I mean, yeah, Democrats, win the popular vote, right? And so they would love to really lean on the democracy parts of our government and kind of not lean on the republic parts of our government. I'm like, oh man. So language comes in a lot. Another thing I'll say, there's a class at what's it called? Miss Porter's school, which is a private school in Farmington, Connecticut. They've started a new course called Intro to Inquiry. And I've just learned about this not long ago. They're using my book as one of their central texts. And so I went and visited their class. And in the first several weeks, they did these incredible exercises where they looked at media from different sides. And so they did a really close analysis of coverage of the immigrants, migrants, who were taken to Martha's Vineyard, the Republican governors, you guys know the story. And so they realized that when they looked at media from the left and looked at media from the right, there was a different word. There were different words for describing different nouns, the people who, crossed the border seeking asylum, but whatever, like maybe flouting some immigration law, but here's how we're trying to handle it. And so some of them used migrants. The word migrant really encodes this sense of, well, we are people with the freedom to move around different countries. It's cool, right? And some of them used illegal immigrant, which encodes the value of legality. And hang on, do they have a right to be here? What's going on? And you can guess which term was used by which side. So what I realized was, because those students had read both stories, they realize that there's more than one way to call the thing, and that the names will encode different values, and that none of those values are, quote, wrong or incorrect. They're all on the table. It's just, what name do you give a thing, and whose values will they encode, and whose values might they reject? You know what I mean? It is a huge puzzle. And I'll stop because I've gone on a long way. But I think my strategy has been, if possible, don't use any of the loaded terms. Describe what you're talking about so that people don't feel like you're already siding one way or the
Hi, my name is Mark. I work for the New York Times. You mentioned just now, like, kind of just you be more descriptive, but we're kind of, for us, we're like limited by the number of words we can use. I guess, what recommendations would you have, or how do you go about finding balanced terms to use? Because we're aimed to be clear and concise, and use brevity. So how do you go about finding words that are more, I guess, balanced, or explain something that's more balanced if like things can have all these sides and stuff?
Yeah, like I said, it's a puzzle, and it's still awkward. I think about here in Seattle several years ago, we started noticing people using the term people experiencing homelessness. People experiencing homelessness, that's kind of a mouthful. And so I saw some interesting ways to try to get around that. Like, instead of homeless, people would say houseless, as if that's very different. The houseless, the homeless, there's something about the, and then a word that's a noun, the homeless, that feels like you are describing an entire person by one characteristic, and that somehow that has felt insensitive and wrong, right? So then I found the term our homeless neighbors, because what I was hearing from readers about, the homeless or other expressions of trying to find a name was that, there wasn't sufficient compassion, or it seemed to reflect this us versus them, right? That those of us writing the news about homelessness and those of us reading the news about homelessness are clearly not homeless ourselves. We're talking about them. But it's like, no, we're all part of the same community, and people want to see things that way. So somehow that term, our homeless neighbors, kind of encapsulated that, but it didn't always work. And so I would just try to use we a little more, and then just try to bring everyone together into one thing. But yeah, I'll go back a little bit and flesh out what I was saying before about trying to describe it without using any terms that have been pretty hijacked by one side or the other. One of the challenges to that too, though, is that the partisan conversations are so intense and so dominant that, I mean, if you want to be found on Google, you better use them, If you don't use them, then people aren't searching for that. Like, who knows if they'll even find you? Or you use too many euphemisms, and then it just becomes unclear. So I recognize the challenge here. I'm trying to think of one more example that I can give. Anyway, I wish I could be a little more helpful, but I think you're right that it's about brevity. And the other thing that I would suggest is asking people themselves how they feel about, some people call this issue X and others refer to it as Y. Some people talk about voting integrity, election security, election integrity, voter suppression, voter rights. Like, which name or label that you're hearing do you think best speaks to how you view this issue? And then you turn to someone else on the other side and ask them the same question. Sometimes I think the best term, honestly, is a slash. Very long story short, there were people through Braver Angels exercise that came together and wanted to have a conversation about elections. One of them was red, one of them was blue. And so one of them wanted to call it about voter rights. And the woman on the red side was like, wait, but there's issues around, I have concerns about voter security. So they decided to name the conversation that they were going to have voter rights / voter security. Okay. And it was an eye-opening for both of them that they needed both names, that if they had picked one or the other name, then the conversation wasn't reflecting both of their concerns.
So one of the things that you said that kind of jumped out at me was the idea that there's no trust institution and that it's through conversations between people, which kind of by definition is not an institution, right? It's
Right.
interpersonal relationships. I guess how much conversations take a long time. It takes a long time to build trust among people. How do you go about creating that space? And do you have to meet people online where it does feel like you are dehumanized really quickly? Is it about a lack of a public square in person? I mean, how are you? That's a really, really, really big mission, I guess, to have enough interpersonal conversations to then restore the fabric of trust in our society. How do you, I guess, accelerate it, or how do you even approach it? I mean, that's a big, big bite to chew.
Yeah, no, this is the $1 million question for the bridging space, which is thoroughly concerned with that, is how can you scale something unscalable? It just doesn't seem, Braver Angels has 50 offerings, all these workshops. And by the way, we were co-founded by a marriage therapist. So all the methods come from this analogy between Democrats and Republicans on the brink and couples at the brink of divorce. Turns out it's the same dang thing, except ideally in America, we can't get divorced. So we have to figure this out. So we have known that even though tens of thousands of Americans have had these conversations, it's still a drop in the bucket. It's nothing. Our theory of change includes when people witness even a model of this type of conversation, even just seeing a model of it. Oh, it's productive. I see the two people on either side, and they're not just trying to change each other. They're trying to understand each other, even for an instant. There's actually some research that shows that in and of itself is already effective because the person has seen that work and then takes that away with them, right? So even one moment of modeling that. So what I think, yes, we're missing a public square where these things can happen, but I think primarily what we're missing is models. Maybe a lot of you know this, a real formative moment for myself as a journalist was back in 2004 with Jon Stewart going on Crossfire. Does anyone know what I'm talking about? He went on Crossfire and he said, this is political theater and it's hurting America. It's Tucker Carlson and Paul Begala just slinging arrows at each other. What's the point, right? And so, oh man, I remember how so many people cheered that as just, yes, exactly right. And that Crossfire was killed. And anyway, I read an essay that gave me what I call an I never thought of it that way moment a couple years ago, which said, you know what? Crossfire was one of the only spaces where the co-hosts who shared power, one was red and one was blue. And yes, they were completely theatrically damaging arguments and whatnot, but they were actually together on the same stage side by side. Like, we've lost that now. All we have is commentators who are on one side or the other and then rule. So it's funny, right? Like, in all these subtle ways, we have lost these models. So I think a lot of it is that I would love to see journalists find some way, some venue where the goal is to help people stay informed about each other's perspectives, and that is the primary goal. And if there is a fact disagreement, we don't hit the abort button. We don't turn off the mics. We get behind it. But that, you're right, that's a pretty big, but I think it's exciting to think about media with wide reach being able to accomplish something like that, because again, I think it's the model. If somebody sees it on television for 5 minutes, they may know in a deeper way what's possible.
Hi, thank you for being with us today. I'm Kurt Beta with National Journal. I guess my question is too, you talked about this feedback you got from some Republicans about how a lot of reporting on, issues of democracy are tinged a little blue, and you use the language of, we're not a democracy, we're a democratic republic. But isn't kind of our job as journalists sometimes to cut through some of the bullshit and spin that we got, especially when it comes from the Republicans like that, when, if there is one party that's actively campaigning about questioning or overturning a presidential
Sorry,
election.
I'm no longer able to hear you. Are you still there?
Yes. Hi. Hello?
There we go. Gotcha.
Sorry.
Okay, back up a few seconds. Yeah.
Yeah. Isn't it our responsibility as journalists and as people who have to be, the truth engine, I guess, to cut through a lot of that bullshit and put them on notice for this, not just like parroting Democratic talking points, but to hold people accountable. They might have preferred language like, election fraud or fraudulent elections or something like that. But when there's no instance of fraud, don't we need to call that out? And how do you balance that with your mission right now?
Absolutely. Yeah, 100%. I mean, we have to stand for truth in the reporting. When we talk about what's going on, we can't mince words about that. And I stand with so many journalists, at least, the ones that I know. I think that being able to call a lie has been a real wonderful improvement, in all kinds of journalism in the last several years. And that's what we have needed to do. The unintended consequence is that for people who feel like there's all kinds of unaddressed concerns, and this really sucks, doesn't it? Even very responsible calling out of what is a fact and what is not, what has enough evidence and what does not, can feel like a slap in the face. And I don't think that's because of the content of that truth or the lie. I think that's because the pools of trust have dried up that much. And I think that we need enough trust in society for people to be able to hear something they don't want to hear. And so then it comes back to like the role of journalists. So I don't disagree with you at all. Like, we have to tell the truth. We can't do anything else. But what I'm starting to think is that I think we also have to help people find enough trust to be able to hear what's uncomfortable. If we don't do both, then the unintended consequence of being really aggressive about what's true and what's not, even though it shouldn't fly in the face of people's concerns, even though it shouldn't feel like an attack on their whole side, it does. It just does.
What does that mean,
so there's
though?
the reality of that. And what do we do?
What does that mean? How can you take, a horse to water this truth well that's dried up and make them drink?
Right, exactly. I'll give an example. Farrah Stockman at the New York Times recently wrote a column that I thought was extraordinary in the way it modeled maybe a path through this. And it was a column about election deniers in New Hampshire. And so she went and met with one person who, denied the election. And even in her column, she said, this was really uncomfortable for me to do. I did not want to approach this person, but I did, and I got to know him. And wow, I mean, she showed a lot of humility in that story. And she asked a question I thought was really interesting. She's like, when people are so passionate about the functioning of their democracy, of the Democratic Republic government, whatever term, but the function of the democracy here in the elections, what is the difference between like a conspiracy theorist and somebody who is a really, really engaged citizen trying to make sure we do things right? It was remarkable. And in the column, she never once said, maybe he's right that the elections are wrong. I mean, no, not to the degree that he's talking about. But somehow in the column, what I think she did is that she sort of pried open some space where none had existed. The principle that I think about here is that, and this is simplistic, I suppose, but it sounds, anyway, that certainty is the enemy of curiosity. When you think you know, you won't think to ask. So what people think is like, election deniers are evil. They're terrible. I've got nothing to learn from them. I cannot give them I can't talk to them. There's nothing. But that's not actually true. There is plenty to learn, and they bring up some interesting points about how there are no continuous standards for how ballots are counted across the country, right? And how the 2020 election, even though there's no evidence for like widespread fraud at all, well, it was the first time a lot of places did mail-in voting, and it was a pandemic. Things were kind of crazy. Okay, right? I think that a little acknowledgement of concerns can go a long way to help people hear what is uncomfortable. And in that column, Farah Stockman did, I thought, a really, really fantastic job. To the point of someone else who just asked a question, it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of time, and that's a luxury a lot of journalists don't have. But it was a really great model, I thought.
Hi, Mark Walker again. How do you conceptually do this without possibly causing more harm in the process of, not in a way, I don't want to call it like both-sidism, but just like not call it causing harm by giving credibility or credence to certain people and certain views?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I mentioned containment a couple times. I think it's a real tool, right? So if it's you and a person, there are places you can go and things that you could ask about and things that they could say in response that might be kind of harmful to the truth if you were to do it in a more public form. But what that means is that you can do that work of getting behind it and seeing what's behind it. And then you could do that work of writing it responsibly so that the concerns and the person is fleshed out as a person who is not necessarily a bad person, right? So you can do that, but then be careful of the other piece. But what I'll say too is this. I'll answer a parallel question because I think it's related. Well, no, let me say this first. So the question of harm is extremely important. And like I said, minimize harm has been an ethical principle in journalism and is in a lot of ways sort of bigger in our consciousness now, I think, than ever. I think that it is easy to see the harm. Thankfully, these days, it's easier to see the harm to groups of people, to folks who've been marginalized, to communities that in some cases finally are getting heard in new and deeper ways, and a lot of that is thanks to social media and the publication revolution and all these ways that we can express ourselves and our lived experience, all that stuff. Awesome. It's harder for folks to see the harm of toxic polarization, the harm of losing trust, the harm of losing these bridges that allow us to have glimmers of insight that remind us that people who disagree with us may not necessarily come from a place of malevolence. I write about in my book what I've realized is maybe the most dangerous assumption that so many of us make and that are allowed to stand. This assumption is often allowed to stand. And the assumption is, if you oppose what I support, you must hate what I love. And that is a very incurious assumption. But again, it's one that is allowed to stand. If you voted this way, then you must be against racial justice. You must be against, civil rights and all these things. And when you approach people, you might see that they have reasons you didn't even consider. I talk too about values. A lot of people say, I can't talk to them because they don't share my values. But as I did some research on values and how they tend to work, I think what is more true is that they do share your values. It's just that they stack them in a different order for different issues. So it's not that someone who opposes vaccine mandates doesn't care about public health, and it's not that someone who supports vaccine mandates doesn't care about freedom. And I think we allow people, I think, to fall into those traps a lot. You don't care about freedom. You don't care about women. You don't care about whatever, and so true. So I think that there is deep harm when we are so divided that we are blinded. And so if we are to ask about harm, we need to also consider that. And even though it is deeper and it is bigger and is a much harder thing to course correct for, we have to keep an eye on that. I think large part what we're doing and the institutions of our society are doing is like, well, we're just doing our job and this thing is happening, but it's not my responsibility. And if no one takes responsibility for that, then how is that piece ever going to get fixed? So I can say much, much more, but I'll leave it at that.
Any final questions?
Oh, actually, can I make one more point? I
Yeah, of
forgot
course.
this piece.
Sorry, I don't
Oh.
know that one.
Sorry, that was my I don't know how. Yeah, the other point I want to make is I mentioned the finding from a study recently about how people on either side despise the other, assume the other side despises them twice as much as they actually do. We also have a lot of statistics and chilling data about anxiety and mental health and how it's just skyrocketed. And people have pointed to politics many times as the source of that. And so I think it's also important to remember that people are really scared. And what if, right? This is hard for folks to embrace, but what if beginning to get a little more curious and beginning to cross those divides doesn't actually add to emotional labor, but ends up subtracting the emotional labor under which you're living every single day when you believe that the world is this scary and that your neighbors are out to get you? What if that's exaggerated? And what if isn't there a lot of harm in people believing that exaggeration rather than the reality? Okay, but
Hi, my name is Candace. I work for the 19th News. I have no idea now that I'm thinking about this. if
Candace,
this-
can you just make sure it's on?
Uh,
Is it green?
I can hear.
Okay.
Okay,
Hey.
great.
I don't know if this is like basically the question that Kirk asked, but maybe a different variation of it. I guess I'm thinking about like how we go out and do some of the stuff you're talking about moving forward. I mean, I just think about, and I don't know how many people are actually like this, but I just feel sometimes that there are a lot of people who automatically see CNN, above a headline, or New York Times above a headline. And because they have a particular association with that publication, automatically dismiss it. So they're not even necessarily getting to the stage of reading the story. So I don't know what my question is. I'm just like, or even a publication like mine, which is not necessarily as well known on a national level, but we cover gender and politics, and a lot of that includes covering trans issues in a really, sensitive way, and like describing that to a particular person who may not understand, transgender issues, that may signal to them to like shut down, and they may not want to talk to us based on that. So I'm curious about how we do this with those kind of associations.
Yeah, I wish I had a really crisp answer that was already on its way. I come back to principles, and one of the principles that's guided me on questions like this is that it's a lot easier to build a relationship with a person than a brand, an authentic one. And so where I see people really cutting through that, despite whatever baggage they're carrying because they're the New York Times or Fox News or what have you, is that they come as people. And they look for sources through relationships wherever there is already some trust, wherever there is already some relationship. That's where you can build more easily. That's a lot harder to do with words on a screen that people just arrive at. And so in that case, what you want to do is surprise people, right? So if you are considered the source that looks at things from this one way and probably isn't open to this other way, then what headline could be written that makes people go, huh? Wait a minute, what? Wait, did they say what I think they're saying? Are they saying something that actually gets to a concern that I never hear them address? Let me click on this. And so it's sort of, it's that principle of start where they are and argue from there, right? So in the case of trans folks, it's a group of people that for a lot of folks who are more traditional, hard to understand. So how do you begin non-harmfully from a place that a more traditional mindset would begin, empathetically, and kind of argue, and by argue is strong, but like tell the story from there. And there could be all kinds of ways. Maybe there's a story of a family that, started with this deep divide and then repaired it. That's a powerful story because you can take the angle of the person who over time saw something in a different way. I don't know, but I'm just trying to kind of give examples. but yeah, it's the principle of start from there and, you know, start where they are and argue from there. And also that it's easier to build a relationship with a person than a brand.
So trust in institutions is at a low, not just for the media, but kind of across the board. We're also seeing, you know, political division not at an unprecedented high, but certainly a high for, you know, not being in civil war. These are huge problems. There's not one solution, but this is, you know, we have 20 journalists who cover DC here. If you gave them one takeaway from the conversation today, what do you hope they walk away with?
I think it's that you all have an enormous opportunity to help people see people again. That while you work on helping people see the shared truth, the truth that is truth all around them, that there are also opportunities and challenges, but mostly mandates to help people understand the truth of other people. That even when people kind of get the facts or what have you of events, we are drastically underinformed about people around us. And that's the thing that's going to need to be repaired for us to have enough trust to engage in a true collective search for truth at all. So I think it's that.
Mónica Guzmán, thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.